Well, again, I'm David Morris. I'm publisher of Lake Drive Books, publishing books that help you heal, grow, and discover. We're a new indie imprint, started just in the last 18 months or so, got 12 books out in the marketplace. One of them is Brandan Flanery's, which we'll talk about a little bit. As you know, this is called, this little session here, this hour-long session is called Growing Up Queer in Evangelical Spaces. You all know, I'm sure, the matter of full inclusion of different sexualities and identities in our spiritual communities is definitely one of the salient issues of our time right now. Churches are splitting, denominations are splitting, new communities are forming. What we're also learning about is more of the actual experience. One of the things when I was working on helping to market Brandan Flanery's book is you may know someone who is queer, but do you really know what their story has been? And I think those are two different things. They certainly have been for me. I'll speak for myself. So we're here for just a brief time to respectfully and safely exchange some thinking and stories. And but it's nice to just do this stuff. Thank you for coming, because it just creates a little community. I think that's what so many of us need these days. So welcome. I'd like to introduce our two speakers here briefly. Not the whole bio, guys. It's just going to be quick ones here. You talk about yourselves. Brandan Robertson is noted author, activist, public theologian, serves as the pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City, and is also known as the TikTok pastor. You do have quite a following there, Brandan. That's really something.
It's a fun time. Yeah. Everybody come over to TikTok.
Yeah. And it's good stuff. It's quality.
Well, thank you.
He's the author of Dry Bones and Holy Wars, and especially is proud of his book, Nomad, A Spirituality for Traveling Light, which was a lot of your own story as well. If we're talking about growing up queer, that would be a good book to mention.
Totally.
And he has a big book coming from St. Martin's Essentials, probably in we'll see, within 12 months, let's put it that way, or something along the lines.
Something like that.
That's really great. Congratulations. So everybody should subscribe to Brandan's newsletters or keep in touch with him so you can see how that's going. Brandan Flanery is an ex-pastor, ex-missionary, ex-evangelical, who writes about the intersection of faith and sexuality. His writings have been in the Scribe, Baptist News Global, Colorado Springs Indy. He's the author of Stumbling, a Sassy Memoir about coming out of evangelicalism, and he's the co-founder of the LGBTQ Christian dating app Believer, which is a sponsor for the event. And we want to thank Believer. Adam Evers, you're here. Thank you for being here and participating. So we're all set. Let's get into some talk. The first question is just basically an easy one, and maybe we'll start with you, Brandan. Just what is your day like on a given day these days? What are you doing? And what's your sense of mission in the work that you're trying to do?
Which Brandan?
Oh, I'm looking right at you. Brandan with an A.
Okay, yes. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll say this to frame it in this conversation: leaving evangelicalism made life disruptive in so many ways. And it's being in the evangelical world, I expected my life to be very simple: to graduate Bible college, to go be a pastor, to get a wife, and that was all I was going to do. Today, my life looks like pastoring a church part-time. And what's interesting, something to say, is the church that I'm in right now is actually a bit more conservative than the communities that I'm usually a part of. And so it's a whole nother kind of walking with the community towards a progressive, inclusive theology. I also spend a lot of time in digital spaces trying to have conversations with people that are still in the fear-based theology of evangelicalism and fundamentalist Christianity, and shock them in the ways that I was shocked by people I discovered on the internet 15 years ago, that helped spark some of my own journey. And then I just do a lot of odd jobs to pay the bills, which is also part of being a queer progressive Christian. We don't have the evangelical money and resources that we once could have had. So
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a busy life, but all good work, and I feel very grateful to be in these spaces that I get to interact with so many different kinds of people doing different variations of what looks like ministry in some form.
So in a sense, there's a lot more creativity going on.
Totally.
Yeah, as hard as it
Yes.
can be. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brandon with an O, how would you answer? What is your life like on any given day, and how do you feel a sense of mission in what you do?
Uh, Good question. For me, it's like the book is the big thing for me. So unlike Brandan, my life is a little bit more simple. I have a day job, so like you said, Brandon, no evangelical money here. So definitely working a day job. I do marketing during the day, and then clock off and do social media. I had this book that came out, Stumbling, Sassy Member, about coming out of evangelicalism, and it was birthed about 2 years ago. Because I was having the same conversation over and over and over again with my straight friends who were coming to terms with their faith and how they might be the bad guy, and what that looked like, especially during 2020. And for me, because of my sexuality, I was forced to process and wrestle with my faith and what I believe about it, and come to terms with how it's been problematic and how I've been complicit in certain things. And so I would just be having the same conversation over and over and over again. And rather than continue to have it, which I love doing, that's why I'm here. But I love the medium of writing. And so that's been my focus for the last couple of months, working with you, David, and getting that published. But it's also my life's gotten a lot more simple. I moved to Atlanta because I grew up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and it's incredibly evangelical. So much so that I was being very reactive. I would engage with an evangelical and I would get defensive. And so I decided to move to Atlanta, and it's been so good. It's a lot more simple. I work a day job. I have a lovely boyfriend, and I don't have to defend myself all the time from the haters, which is lovely. On social media, that happen all the time, and I can do that. And now that I've taken space and gotten healing and worked through a lot, it's been so good because I can have those conversations, and I'm actually energized by that rather than defensive. So that's my life in a given day. And when it comes to mission, I guess wanting people to be more free and less scared. And so for me, that engages with spirituality and having meaningful conversations and engaging people authentically to give them permission to be authentic. Those are kind of some of my big things that are important to me these days.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, there is something about the having safe space and taking care of yourself and giving yourself room, even if it means maybe withdrawing more than you might normally think you should be doing. But we do need to speak about one sort of there's a pregnant meaning here, and it's you, where you are, Brandon with an O. Where are you right now?
I'm in my closet. Yeah, when I first started going on TikTok, I was like in conversation with a couple publishers, and one of the questions was like, who's gonna buy this book? And I was like, well, I'll just put stuff out on TikTok and see what happens. And so some of my earliest content was me hiding in a closet because it was the only quiet place in my house. And I thought it was hilarious because I'm gay. Newsflash. And then that's where I talk about like these really like serious like reframing spirituality. So like a blessing for queer people would be an example of one, but it was Closet Chronicles. And now since I live with a roommate, I think it's a fun homage to always do these podcasts in my closet. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. I think, as this conversation goes on, we want to get to some of the big themes, but we did title this Growing Up Queer in Evangelical Spaces. And so let's start with life story. Let's start with that data, and which sounds kind of cold, but you know what I mean. Let's start with real life. How about back to you, Brandon with an A? What experience would you like to talk about when it comes to people growing up within evangelicalism? How do you frame that for yourself personally or more generally?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, obviously, there are so many different moments along the journey where my growing understanding of my queerness bumped up against the evangelical world I was in. But I think the most dramatic and most transformative in both good and bad ways for me was when I went off to college. I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, a very conservative evangelical school. And my thought process was that if I would go to Moody and begin studying to be a pastor, that God certainly was going to take away my same-sex attraction because I was finally enacting this calling that God had placed on my life, and my homosexuality was going to keep me from living out that calling. So I went to Moody with this subconscious hope that over the 4 years I was studying there, I'd be healed. And what ended up happening is over the course of those 4 years, in God's grace, I saw evangelicalism for what it was. Um, in my 4 years at Moody, I was threatened with expulsion 6 times. Not for anything fun. I wasn't drinking or smoking or anything like that. It was heresy. It was, I was blogging and podcasting, asking questions about some of the core evangelical doctrine. And we're talking about like non-orthodoxy things, like whether the rapture is real, like those kind of things. And I was getting called into the dean's office and threatened with expulsion because I was bringing in false teaching to the school. And then when I started talking to an ex-gay professor. Moody had a very prominent ex-gay author and speaker on our faculty, and I confessed my same-sex attraction to him in hopes that he would help kind of guide me towards the holy path. And what I experienced from him was also fear and rejection. And eventually, Moody asked me in my senior year to do conversion therapy in order to prove that I was actually an evangelical in order to graduate. And I did that. I tried earnestly for an entire year, meeting with a different ex-lesbian professor. And by the end of that year, I became so certain that this fear and this abuse that I had experienced for 4 years was nothing like the Jesus that I understood in the scripture. And the conversion therapy and the theology about sexuality clearly wasn't working. And I was the most earnest person trying to do this. Like, I really wanted to be right with God. Um, and this sounds cliche, but I promise this happened. Right before I graduated, I was leaving the dean's office my senior year after they threatened me and told me I needed to go to conversion therapy to graduate. I went in and I opened up my Bible like a good evangelical, and I landed on First John. And the verse that says, God is love, and perfect love casts out all fear, because fear has to do with judgment. Those words changed everything in that moment. Like, my eyes literally opened, and I was like, oh, this religion that is all based on fear is not of God, because God and fear cannot coexist. God expels fear. And that began opening me towards both being able to accept my sexuality and that I could be a Christian and be queer. And I began a journey towards discovering progressive, inclusive Christianity, which saved my life and changed my life.
What was the end of the story for you at Moody?
I graduated by the grace of God, although 6 months later they asked Moody, for those who don't know, all students go there tuition free. So everyone's given a scholarship. They started asking me to repay my scholarship or give back my degree because they thought I got it on false pretenses, which is illegal, and I didn't do that. But yeah.
Institutions. Yeah.
Yes.
And over to you, Brandan Flanery. I'm sure you obviously some very similar patterns, but you have your own story as well.
Yeah, really similar. My flavor of Christianity was very charismatic. I grew up at a megachurch. I worked at Team Mania Ministries. I worked at a church as a pastor in the AG kind of flavor of Christianity. Was in YWAM. I like to say I drink deep of evangelicalism. I went to IHOP, all the different things. Went to Bethel, and there was a belief that eventually, if I believed hard enough, or if I waited for the right girl, eventually my same-sex attraction would be resolved. And it's interesting because I could point to spaces in my life where I felt very asexual, and I can reflect on it now and be like, oh, it's because I was like in love with this person. Like I can look at how I was sideways getting good yearnings in my heart met in sideways ways. And so everything came to a head for me after I left YWAM. I'm a big believer that exposure to difference is so important to change us, and living overseas for a year really, in a good way, did a number on me. For me, I'm white, I'm cis, I'm a man, and my personality fits well with evangelicalism. But my sexuality was always that one thing that was ruining it for me. And to be something I'd fixate on this is what, and I went to New Life Church where Ted Haggard was like, there was a big debacle. And so like being haunted by his story of like, well, I can't do this. because it's going to blow up, but would always attempt to trust and believe and kind of go for it. But coming back from YWAM, it, even though I resented my sexuality for so long, it finally came to the surface. And I'm resenting it because it felt like it was costing me so much, specifically this dream of being married to a woman, being a pastor, being these things, being normal. And it's the one thing that I couldn't shake and change. But I'm so grateful for my sexuality because it is the thing that shook everything up. It is the thing that wouldn't let go. And so for that reason, it did force me to come to terms with some really big, important questions that initially made me panic and freak out and my faith collapse, but like reforging a spirituality that is one where I'm encountering the divine in a beautiful way, where I can be more hopeful and open rather than cynical and controlling. And to be honest, Brandon, like that idea of like not hate being the opposite of love, but fear, and how so much of evangelical Christianity is rooted in that, was really important for me to not just bring healing to myself, but I'm a firm believer that, as Henry Nouwen writes, that healing comes from showing our wounds, from being open and vulnerable, because we're all the same at the wellspring of hope and life. And so that's what my story ultimately comes back down to. And the reason I'm not an atheist is because I've had some beautiful encounters with the divine. And it's that kept me coming back to a faith in something beyond me. I love Jesus. It's just the followers that can be really hard for me. And I've done a lot of reconciliation around that too, because there are some beautiful, beautiful expressions of spirituality, specifically in the Christian faith, that I've come into. Adam and I went to With Collective Launchpad with some progressive pastors there, and great community there. So, and that really gave me hope, and like, oh, just because I've moved away from evangelicalism doesn't mean that's the only flavor of Christianity that can serve you. And it's not the only right one. Because I think that's the biggest thing that evangelicalism promises, that we have the right answer. And now I'm really comfortable not having answers and instead being curious. So
let me these sessions always go by really quick, and we had a lot of questions, but I'm going to jump to one of the big questions here. And I think it kind of connects to a little bit of what you both have just been saying. Should queer people try to stay Christian, seeing how harmful the religion has been to them? And I can't remember who suggested this one. I thought it was maybe you, Brandan Robertson.
Yeah, I did throw that in actually today because this is something I've come to terms with and like been encountering much more since living in New York City. I moved here a year ago. Before, like, first of all, I was unaware until probably about a year ago that I actually had religious trauma, which is ironic, because anybody who hears my story would be like, oh, of course you have trauma, but I was unaware. And moving to New York, I've had this constant encounter, whether it's like going on dates with people or just meeting people who find out that I'm a queer pastor. And the response is not intrigue or interest or anything like that. It's, I don't want anything to do with you. Christianity is bad. How could you ever be a part of something that has hurt our community so profoundly? And at first, my reaction to that was like, I was like, damn, I'm getting it from all sides. Like the queers don't want me and the Christians don't want me. But the more I reflected on it, the more it's a real question that I've been grappling with. I think obviously there are a good number of us queer people who have an unshakable and enduring faith in Jesus. But in the queer Christian world, the one thing that I've found that I don't think is helpful anymore is those who believe you can just change your interpretation of 6 verses of the Bible and keep the whole evangelical system and world and belief system together and just keep going forward as inclusive but traditional Christians. What I've come to see is that the way we have framed traditional conservative Christianity from the ground up is the problem. It's not 6 verses that are the problem. It is the view of God in evangelical Christianity that is the problem. It's how we view the Bible that is the problem. It's our theology of atonement that is the problem. All of these things are tied to toxic fear-based theology. And so when I am with queer people, now my first response to people who are afraid of me being a queer Christian pastor is, I get it, and I reject all of that too. Like, I actually am very ironically anti-institutional Christianity, though I lead a Christian institution, because it's like I understand that I think so much of it is irredeemable. But I believe in the power of the Spirit. This is the charismatic side of me coming out. I think God is still doing something new in our day. And my invitation to queer people is, I don't want you to become a Christian. I don't even want you to come to my church. If you don't want to, fine. But be open to the fact that something is happening. Queer people, on average, are more spiritual and religious than the general population. There are almost every major Protestant denomination, the majority of Protestant denominations in the United States are now fully affirming of queer people. That is something nobody would have ever been able to predict 10 years ago. And yet here we are. Something is changing. And so all of that long answer to say, my invitation to queer people who are skeptical of religion is I'm skeptical too, and we should be, because religion, Christianity is problematic. But something is going on. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, if Jesus still resonates for you, hang on to Jesus and see where it leads. If broad spirituality is what resonates with you, great. But something is happening. I believe God does revival from the margins. And I think something is happening in the queer community, a spiritual reformation of sorts.
Well said. Well said. Brandan Flanery, we've talked about this topic a little bit, I believe, too. You know, and you're a different person. You're coming at it from a different point of view or different experiences. How do you talk about whether or not you should still stay Christian, or how do you reconcile being queer with being Christian, which Brandan so are well articulated?
Yeah. I think for me, is it serving you is my biggest question for queer people in that space. And I've heard both, and I have no judgment for either. For me, it's interesting because I'm falling back to some verses that are now haunting me. And one of them is judge something by its fruit. And so, to be quite frank, I don't really care if you have the right answer, because there's a lot of people that claim to have the right answer that are hurting people. I think there are a lot of people that are arguing over the right answer that crucified Christ. So I don't think that I no longer have a right answer. I think that's what keeps a lot of people in evangelicalism. I would say if that's why you're there, I would challenge why you're staying there, to be quite frank. But if it's serving you, if it's cultivating goodness in you, if it's making you a better person to the people around you, if it's giving you hope, again, to quote another verse that's haunting me is like, if anything is lovely and admirable, think about such things. And so that's where I would fall back when it comes to someone who's wrestling with staying in this space. I will argue with this too. One of the reasons that Believer was created is because there was a phrase that Adam and I would consistently say as we felt we were too queer for Christians and too Christian for queers. And to point at Robertson's like experience with dating, that would happen to me all the time. And so for us, it was a big, important thing where we could go on a date and we wouldn't have to defend ourselves, because it felt like, man, I have to defend myself with Christians all day. I don't want to defend myself with going into a queer space too. And I'm in this weird limbo predicament. And so it was so important for us to help foster that space, specifically for forming meaningful connections, especially the romantic kind. And so I do think that there is something where I'm a firm believer in the X period. Our bodies, when they're registering hurt and pain that's been happening, it is so important that there's an X moment so that our bodies are fighting for us to make safety for us, whether that be running away, fight or flight, or we're like getting defensive and learning about how we can defend ourselves against problematic theology that's hurting us or systems of oppression within these religious spaces. I think it is important that if it is causing harm, to listen to your body and to create safety inside of yourself. And then once that happens, then you can move on to dating something else. And maybe it is coming back to Christianity, but I'm a firm believer, and this is me projecting because I've seen it in myself, of I used to be, I think being reactive is a symptom of showing you that you're it's like bumping into a bruise, like emotionally. It's like, I need to say something and react rather than having an authentic reaction. And I think that as we heal from our pains of evangelicalism, that's where we can look at something more less critically and actually take inventory of, is it serving us? And I would say that there's some spaces that are in that intersection that were so helpful for me. Like QCF healed me in such deep ways to see queer people doing communion together. It was such a simple moment, but it rocked my world so much so that I like write about it. Like they're being in progressive Christian spaces. It was like, oh my gosh, these people exist, and it healed me in such powerful ways. But to return back to Robertson, some points there is like, just because they're affirming doesn't necessarily heal things. You know, there's also the question of, are you going to be oppressing women? Are you going to be oppressing trans individuals? Fundamentally believe that like, as you should cheer on the world getting shittier because that means maybe God's coming back. Like there's some problematic things that we can believe that are causing harm, that it's not enough just to deal with the LGBTQ question. I think it's really important that it analyzes more than that.
Let me stay with you for a moment, Brandon Flanery, because I think this was your question about the relationship between the biblical text and your sexuality, or even just how do you, I mean, we're all, if you're raised in evangelicalism, you're raised to keep the Bible as like, it's like primary in certain ways. And I think this gets to what you were saying, Brandan Robertson, about how the ground up of evangelicalism and how we understand sacred text and approach it in the first place. What about for you, Brandon Flanery? Let's start with you in this and mix it up a little bit. How do you view the Bible these days?
As a tool that can be used for harm or good. And I did not used to think that even about a year and a half ago. At first it's like Father, God, Holy Bible is how evangelicalism really relates to the Bible. It's like this, it's a divinity, and it can't be questioned or challenged. And I was seeing it cause harm so much so that when I started to come out, I avoided it. It felt like I was playing minefield, and I was terrified I was going to click the wrong verse. And then I bump into something that would hurt me. And so I took space from it. But then I was sitting down with some progressive faith leaders, and this Black lesbian pastor started talking about how much she loved the Bible. And I was both curious and angry. And so being the person that I am, I'm just a very curious person. It's got me in trouble. That's why I love like journalism. It's why I like asking questions. Like that's more of my safety spot. I just love it because I just want to learn as best I can, and I never want to stop learning. So I like don't necessarily jump her, but I immediately went to her after the talk, and I'm like, how can you like the Bible? It's caused so much harm to you, to me. Like, why would you endorse it? And she like patiently smiled with me. And she was just like, because I see it for what it is. It's not, I see it for people wrestling with who the divine could be. I see it with people trying to understand who God is. And I see a God reaching out through them, making mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, wooing them and wanting them. So I no longer see it as something perfect, but I see it for what it is. And that is a text of people trying to understand who the divine is. And that's why I love it. And I was just like, yeah. But it helped me. It helped me return. And so now for me, I can jump into a text, and I can actually jump into multiple texts. Like I'm reading some Taoism right now, where it's just like, I want to bump into the divine. If that's in Psalms, great. If that's in a movie, great. If it's in poetry, great. And the Bible is one of those many mediums.
Want to bump into the divine. That's a wonderful phrase. Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Brandan Robertson? This is part of your trade.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love the Bible. And it's not always been easy. And I think all of us have that moment as queer people of like, the Bible is a terrifying book, but through the study over the past 10 years that I've been privileged to do, and right now I'm getting a PhD in the Bible, because what I've discovered as I've gone deeper and deeper into the text, and also particularly from hanging out with Jewish friends who, by the way, the Bible is from them. And so if you want to learn about how to read the Bible, do it with a bunch of amazing Jewish interpreters, and seeing
cool.
how they engage the text as not the inerrant word of God, but this mysterious treasure chest with layers of meaning, that has multiple interpretations. that still values the historical, cultural context and language, but also says God can be speaking a new thing through these ancient words to you in the kind of similar way charismatics talk about the Bible. Um, and the other thing that has been most transformative about the Bible for me in the place I am today is just some of the basic realizations that we all know, but most people don't actually think about. The Bible, though it's been a tool of privilege and power and oppression for 2,000 years, was written by oppressed people for oppressed
Mm,
people from an oppressed perspective. And so, yes, it has been misused and very harmful. But if we can try to dig down and get back to the person who was writing Leviticus and understand that whoever he was, and it likely was unfortunately a dude, but whoever he was living in an oppressed people, and the purpose of Leviticus was to preserve his people from these outside cultures that are trying to come in and colonize them. And it shifts. And I have a lot more empathy for the author of the Bible, and I see
mm,
how people get to where they get, even if I disagree with it. And um, at the end of the day, the Bible is a reflection. Brandon, you said this beautifully. It's an evolution of how people understand God and relate to God. And I can see my own evolution of spirituality within
mm.
the pages of the Bible,
Yeah.
from the conservative, very narrow God of the book of Job, who makes bets on people's lives and wagers with Satan, to the God that we see at the very end of the book of Revelation, where the kingdom is opened up for all people to come and stand around God's table in equity and peace for all eternity. Like, there's a beautiful story going on here. And we can't just concede this book to the conservatives. That's my
Mm,
biggest pet peeve, is too many progressive
mhm,
Christians, too many gays just say, screw the Bible, it's bad for us. No, when you do that, you give the most influential book in the world still all of that power and authority to the hands of conservatives to continue
mm.
oppressing us. And that is not a winning strategy. So, off my soapbox now, I promise.
No, that's okay. This is the soapbox time. Thank you. I believe this was your question, Brandon Robertson. And this kind of surprises me, but obviously it also shows my ignorance that conversion therapy continues to flourish
Mm.
under new names and modalities.
Yeah.
The interest in it, I can understand, but I think there's a lot of there has been a lot of talk around how it's proven not to work, but people still see it as an option who are unaware of that, perhaps.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by it continues to flourish and under new names and modalities? What's been your experience?
Yeah. I mean, so this is informed by my own experience, my own interest in the field, but also I recently did a show where they brought together Christian gays and ex-gay Christians to have a
Mm,
conversation. And it really was eye-opening to me because all of the ex-gays that were brought in for this debate were all under the age of 20, or like 25, I mean.
mm,
So these are all very young people who had all ended up in churches that had thriving conversion therapy ministries. And yet, if in the debate that I was in, they were asked directly, do you support conversion therapy? And they said no. And that led me to start digging about like what's happening here, and realizing just a little bit of research that like reparative therapy was what conversion therapy was originally called. A guy named Joseph Nicolosi created the modality. His son now has started a movement called regenerative therapy, which is reparative therapy that his dad started under a new name. Ex-gays are now saying we don't believe in conversion therapy, but we do believe you should go to your church and be prayed to be healed from the demon of homosexuality, which is the same thing. And so what's happening these days is in San Diego, when I was pastoring there, we saw this in a real way. The largest church in San Diego, which I will name, the Rock Church, very famous evangelical church, pretty moderate people. Democrats go there and Republicans go there. And they had a heal from your homosexuality ministry under this very flowery name. And yet we're getting off as this moderate middle ground evangelical church that lots of gay people were going to. And it's that kind of stuff that I think we have a responsibility as queer Christians to call out, because it's dishonesty and it is using a modality, either from the pastoral perspective or psychological perspective, that every psychological association in the country has condemned as objectively harmful, that all of our stories who have ever gone through any version of pray away the gay or conversion therapy can tell you doesn't work. And so all of that to say, conversion therapy is happening in whatever town you are in, all of you on this call. And if you go to your local megachurch's website and you dig deep enough, I promise you'll find language of healing prayer. You'll find language of all sorts of sexual wholeness. And this is all new language people are using to hide the fact that they're trying to heal queer people from their queerness. And I feel like in this next phase of my life and my ministry, this is something I really want to focus on, because I think progressives have let the conservatives get away with this rebranding and rechanging the language, thinking that it's all good and nobody's doing conversion therapy anymore, when in fact, every city, every town has a church that is doing some version of this. And it's one of the most lethal things to LGBT people that could be done.
Yeah.
It's real harm. You can't debate that.
Yeah.
I even think about, like, with some of my source where I didn't even realize I was in conversion therapy until I, like, years later reflected back on it. Like, that's how sneaky it can be, where I'm just, meeting with this counselor, but then she was now reflecting back, I'm like, oh, there's a strategy involved. It was like, I must be estranged from my father. I must have an overbearing mother. I need to connect with men. Like, there was a recipe, which I know people at Focus on the Family that created that formula who've recanted it. And so it's now like getting space from it. It's so much so where I think there's a lot of us, as we reflect backwards, like, oh man, I bumped into this, or was hurt, not even bumped into it. I was hurt and wounded by it, and I didn't even know, because it didn't look like electric shock therapy, because that's the only thing that we think of.
Yeah. Just on that last thing, like, we have these images from the not beautiful, but important stories that have been told over the past few years on, like, movie screens of conversion therapy being sent away to camp, locked in a room, beaten with a Bible. Like, that happens still, and that's horrifying. But it's so much more insidious, I believe, than sending people away to camp, when it's happening to people that don't even know it's happening to them.
Right.
And yet, even that thing that Brandan just said, that's Joseph Nicolosi. He says the way you make a gay is overbearing mother, distant abusive father equals gay child. That was so ingrained in me even after coming out. Until this year in meeting with my psychotherapist, he was like, Brandan, that's not true. Like, that's had no bearing on your sexuality. And I was like, what do you mean? Of course it did. But that's how insidious this is. It's dropping those things that make you question why you are the way you are, and if there was something sinful or broken about what made you queer. And it's really damaging.
Rather than beautiful. Yeah.
The way that symbols get leveraged in faith communities can have such an impact on someone growing up developmentally. My background is in psychology and religion. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how children in evangelicalism are asked to sort of profess their sins, say the sinner's prayer at 5 years old. You're taking on an adult mindset of changing your whole personality at 5 years old. Well, that's what you call psychological splitting. It starts happening right there. And that just has long, that's not something you can shake or overcome, right away. Yeah. Is this at all connected? Brandan Flanery, you talked about the gay glass ceiling.
I think it for sure. I mean, especially with this language of branding and churches, while there's definitely politically, like, drag queens are being attacked, trans communities being attacked, and very brazenly, there's still this undercover rebranding of what it means to engage with queer people. And rather than churches owning, like, we actually don't trust queer people to be in our congregation, we actually don't believe that how they're created is beautiful and holy in the eyes of God, they would rather say all are welcome. And then you bump into things where really what is truly believed is there. And that's been my experience. And I think that it comes from, like, no one wants to be the bad guy. And so to be LGBTQ, to be homophobic, to be transphobic, that's not cute. It's not something that it's great that people frown on that. For most of from the bigger population, most people would say, hey, that's not cool. Like, as a teacher that has worked in the public school system, like that is how teenagers relate to this. Like they would check homophobia way before I even could open up my mouth. And the general population is there. And so evangelical Christianity has done something. This is a joke that I make often in my book, and that is we're really good at branding and rebranding. And to point back to Brandon's point of this changing of name, like we know it's an art that it's the reason I'm good at marketing. It's because I was raised in evangelicalism. And so there is this switching of language where all are welcome. That's for sure. That's true. You can walk in the door. You can sit in the seat. You can sit in the pew, but I don't trust you to volunteer in children's ministry because there's a belief, there's a harmful theology that I have that says that you are untrustworthy with my kid because there's something sexually wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. And so for me, it is not enough for churches to say, we welcome all. That's not good for me. What is good for me is saying you are affirmed. Like that language in particular, for people who've done the work, they'll use that language. They'll put it on their website. And I'm really fortunate where like someone from my old megachurch I grew up in, like a pastor there, found my book and she wanted to have a conversation. We talked very candidly about this. I'm like, the most loving thing you can do is put it on your website. And she was sharing how, well, we want to not lose, we don't want to hurt people through policy. We want to have conversation. I'm like, that is, as a queer person, I get scared hearing that language because while you're willing to have a conversation, there are some things you are not willing to do. You're not willing to marry me. You're not willing to let me be in leadership. And those things should be on your site because I view that as informed consent. And that's how churches can truly serve queer people, even if you're not affirming. That is, that, in my opinion, that is love, to be honest, rather than to use, again, language from the Bible, be a deceiver, which Jesus says you're the children of Satan when you do that. And so it's something that I like throw back at Christians, just like, just be honest. Like Jesus says, like he is the truth, like be candid so that queer people can make an informed choice to come to your pew or not, rather than rebranding this and hurting people further and re-traumatizing them because they get their hopes up. People who don't know this, myself included, we hear all welcoming, we come in, we even have conversations with pastors and get really excited. And then next thing you know, I call it the gay glass ceiling because I was never told to me that I couldn't lead worship. It was never told to me that I couldn't be in children's ministry until I was wondering, like, why does it always seem like I like a magnet? I can't quite get there. And then later I'd find out why. It was there's this gay glass ceiling behind this ruse of everyone's welcome.
Yeah, and this was one of our questions: is what can pastors do to support queer people in their congregation? And let's back over to you, Brandan Robertson. But then let's get to a couple questions here. If folks want to put them into the chat, I see one from Kevin, which we can get to. Thank you. But what would you advise?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with everything that Brandan has said. I think it is so ironic to me that for evangelicals who believe that they have the truth, that they are becoming so increasingly uncomfortable with saying, what is the truth? And if this is God's word, please preach it. Be loud and clear. Tell the gays that we're going to hell. Like, say it. And I actually think there's value in being clear in that way. For progressive churches, this is something I've wrestled with. I wrote a book a few years ago called True Inclusion, wrestling with the question of like, what does a progressive church do once it's now open and affirming? It's using the language. It knows how to talk about queer people. It's including queer people. This, I don't want it to move us off topic, but my advice to churches, a lot of churches think that once they get through the open and affirming process, like they're done, they've checked the justice boxes, they're progressive, great. And I actually like, good for all the churches that want to fly the rainbow flag and march in the pride parade. But if you stop your inclusion with just having queer people in leadership and being okay, like you haven't understood true inclusion, you haven't understood justice. And I think the true queer path, the heart of the queer community, is this understanding that inclusion's not a one-time process, it's an ongoing posture. Inclusion doesn't just mean white gays, which is what a lot of progressive churches welcome. It means so many different people that make up the beautiful queer community and beyond. And so the posture of inclusion is not a church growth strategy. In fact, if you want to grow your church, don't be inclusive. Evangelical churches prove that very well. But if you're going to be inclusive, do it because you're convicted that there are people that need a community, a place to belong, that need to know that they are beloved. and constantly be asking yourself, who is outside of our walls that does not want to come into this space because it is not welcoming to them, even as hard as we're trying? And how do we reorient ourselves? How do we create policies and systems in our churches that make it so that Black trans folks want to come into this church, that people with disabilities want to come into this church, X, Y, and Z, all the other marginalized communities.
Even how we understand the Bible and that it's written by oppressed, those who've been oppressed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's one thing to say we understand the 6 verses, we're queer and affirming on these 6 verses, but are you willing to do the hard work to grapple with what Paul says about race and how that plays out in the Bible? Like, this is why, again, I said it's not just changing a few interpretations. The whole system is corrupt through and through. It is not the way Jesus
Even
talked
sometimes
about
in an affirming mainline church, it can still have the evangelical
especially
accretions to them. Yeah.
especially in the affirming mainline church. And so I think the affirming mainline church is obviously better than the evangelical church in terms of harm and morality, but I think I've encountered so many pastors that have this evangelical feeling, self-righteousness, because they have the boxes of queerness checked. And it's like, yet most of my queer friends actually would not be included in your church, even though you're open and affirming. So let's work on that. This
That's
is a
very
journey.
interesting.
It's not a process that you go through one time.
We have 10 minutes or a little bit more. Question from Kevin for Brandan Robertson. The documentary hypothesis of the Hebrew Bible has had a significant impact on Kevin and its view of sexuality and gender. Has this been impactful for you too?
Yeah, somewhat. I think part of what the documentary hypothesis is about the composition of like the book of Leviticus, the Hebrew Bible, how this is put together, the different communities and voices that are creating these singular documents that we have. I think I'm actually quite fundamentalist when it comes down to my interpretation of those 6 verses. I actually think it's really clear, really simple. I don't see much room for disagreement, despite some progressive scholars disagreeing. Like, I think the Hebrew Bible was talking to cultures that valued sexual exploitation and abuse as a way of asserting their dominance. That's it, period. All 6 verses fall under that we are talking about ancient pagan cultures that understood that the way you assert gender and ethnic and cultural dominance is by sexually exploiting and abusing slaves, prostitutes, other people. And I really think it's just that simple, that is what Leviticus is getting at. That is what Paul is getting at. That is what the entire message of the Bible is. And by the way, I support that message. I support the clobber passages in what they're actually condemning. And so I think we can get lost in culture, context, texts, and backgrounds on these verses. And I just have come to the conclusion that it's actually really simple. And if you read the texts in and of themselves, they say this. Every single clobber passage is surrounded by verses about sexual exploitation and abuse. That's what it's about. Anyways.
Yeah. Brandan, Flanery, did you want to respond to that or next question?
I'm good. I think it was good job.
Maybe you could respond to this one, Brandan Flanery, although Brandan Robertson was kind of addressing it. From Chris, what do you say when you're at a pride event and you see people from a church there to protest, even if doing so in a kind and respectful way?
I actually, Atlanta just had our Pride a couple weeks ago because it gets so hot here that we moved it to October. And there was this really beautiful moment where there was plenty of I forgot that protesters exist, to be quite frank. That's how much I've been I am protecting me and getting healing, where I'm not engaged in these spaces. And so I'm walking to Pride with my boyfriend, happy, and all of a sudden I look ahead and oh, you exist. There was this because I had not been in those spaces. And so I'm you're in our space, get out. But what happened was, and I immediately started to smile because there's this group where, and there's a number of different groups like this that are happening across the country that I think this is what allyship looks like. And they're called the Paisley's. I think that's what it is. And they have these massive, massive flowers that cover the signs, and they hold them in front of them. And they get a DJ and they're blasting diva music. So you can't hear these people protesting. And I just like, I started to get teary-eyed because I'm just like, I think this is what love actually looks like. I think this is what maybe Jesus would look like. I think this is what actually allyship looks like, not just like, well, I'm cool with you getting married to a guy. And so I just was really, in a beautiful way, was impacted by protesters. And so, but personal interaction, I would say that like, it depends on my piece. Cause again, like I don't owe them anything. I don't need to defend me. In fact, I would say that what I try to do is an identity that I don't hold. I think it's more important that I be an ally, and so that a trans person doesn't have to always defend being trans. My friends who are people of color don't have to always defend and express why there's racism happening. And so I would rather I get more defensive in those spaces rather when it comes to it's just funny because when it comes to me, I'm always just like, believe what you want. I'm living a happy life. And if you want to engage about the Bible, we can. And I do, like I do it on social media. And I will if I have like a grace for that, where I'm like, I actually can engage in this conversation and it's going to be meaningful. But I try not to waste my energy with someone I know it's not going to change. And I'm in a space now where I had to do that. In the past, I had to do that. And now I'm in a space where I'm like, I want to live my life and be happy. If I believe that this conversation will change you, then I'll step into it. If not, then I'm going to say, have a nice day.
Mm-hmm. Amanda writes, growing up in evangelicalism, purity culture and sexuality were so intertwined. When it comes to the sinfulness of the homosexual, there seemed to be a direct link to pornography and sexuality sin. For me, this was a challenge to overcome as I embraced a healthy understanding of queer sexuality. Have either of you experienced or found healing from purity culture? Which I'm sure you've had your own unique experience. Who would like to jump in on that?
You want to go, Robertson? Yeah.
Sure. I'll just say, I mean, I've been anguishing over this question. The last section of this new book that I'm writing is me trying to express what a queer sexual ethic looks like. And I have so much of the purity culture Bible verses still in here. And that yet I also have my experience, which from that paradigm of moving from fear to love, I've been able to experiment like many queer people experiment and like figure out what it looks like to have a healthy sexuality in the way, by the way, that I think all humans developmentally should have a period of their life that they get to explore and experiment with. Purity culture runs as deep as the homophobia of the 6 clobber passages. Like I said, those verses, those ideas run deep in us. And I think one of the most healing things for me was being in church spaces where I heard a pastor candidly say what's true, which is that the Bible does not condemn premarital sex. The Bible is not a sex guide for you. Sexuality is as unique as every individual person is. And so feel free to explore and express. And here are some guiding values for you, like that come from our tradition. And for me, the guiding values are consent, obviously, mindfulness, understanding why I have a sexual desire and what the best way to express that is. And from that foundation, I feel like healthy sexuality can flow with the understanding that there is grace. Nobody can figure out their own sexual self perfectly on the first try.
Yeah.
But sexuality is not a sin. Exploring your sexuality is not a sin. God is not standing over your bedroom trying to figure out what you're doing so that he can judge you. You were created as a sexual being because it's a good thing. And so explore it, be free. And that's how I try to live these days. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Brandon.
Man, yeah, I would say culture. She's hard to shake. And I'm in a really beautiful space now. But man, it really wreaked havoc on relationships. My very first queer relationship. I mean, my last straight relationship. I'm really good at the whole purity culture thing because I didn't want to kiss a girl, let alone have sex with her. So I was not only saving myself for marriage with purity culture, which allowed me to hide and be a really good evangelical, but I was even saving my first kiss. I had my first kiss I was 25 with a girl. And so when I started to be sexually active in a monogamous loving relationship, which now I don't hold monogamy to this like idolatrous, I would say truly idolatrous standard. If it serves you, then great. If not, I'm in a monogamous relationship right now, but if it doesn't serve you, great. There's plenty of polyamory in the Bible, but I couldn't engage even in that type of sex with my partner and feel happy and joyful about it. There was a moment where I got out of the bed and started crying, and purity culture does a number on us. And it's not just queer people. Like Robertson said, like I have straight friends that they've been married for years and they still haven't had intercourse because it's such a hard thing to engage with, because you can't just shift that shame overnight. But now, man, I love sex. I think it's so beautiful. But I relate to it like fire. So again, like I've resurrected some things from purity culture. I'm like, this serves me. It's good for me. I'm going to take it. But more about it in my book. I talk very at length about it. I'm not going to do it right here. But I view it like fire now. And I think this is maybe I'm grabbing some things where I'm like, this has served me. And it can keep me warm. It can bring light to my world. It can fuse things, but it can also burn things down. And I've experienced that where my sexuality ran rampant. And how I was relating to my sexuality caused me to disassociate and not connect. Instead, it was something that I needed to serve rather than it served me. And so something now is, sex for connection is so beautiful, and I want to protect that. That doesn't mean it has to necessarily be in a certain context. And that's what's really beautiful and fun for me now, is having a conversation with my partner of like, what do we want our sexuality to look like? We're not going to inherit something. We can, but let's create something that serves us, that gives you respect and dignity, that gives me respect and dignity, but also gives us freedom. And so we get to decide what this looks like, where we're guarding our fire. And it's been really beautiful and fun. So that's what I would say about my sexuality.
Well, thank you. Let me sort of try to help us wrap this up a little bit. I want to first start by saying that, and I have one more question for both of you that I'd like to get to. We've had some good comments. Thanks everyone who's chatted. Sorry if we haven't been able to comment on everybody's comment there. I hope you've been able to see some of what each other has posted here. I turned it back on so everybody could see it. We were trying to just be careful at first. I have put in links for both Brandan Robertson and Brandan Flanery on their websites, Instagram and TikTok. They're all there doing great job on each one. Lots of fun stuff, lots of informative stuff there. It really helps. Every little bit helps that you do to follow and like and share. That's the way things work. I'm in publishing. A lot of commerce happens because of the social aspect of social media. So I'm very positive on social media. I know there's a lot of reason to be cynical as well. But I would encourage you to follow up with both Brandons here tonight. That's mainly it. Brandan Flanery's book is out in paperback now today. Stumbling, sassy memoir about coming out of evangelicalism. And Brandan Robertson, go to his website. He's got quite a number of his own resources listed there under his books page. It's very impressive. You do a good job speaking as a publishing person. It's nice to see an author doing that so well. So I just want to wrap up. We're at an hour now. Let's end on this note. What do each of you do, considering the chaos and the complexity and the disruption that you both have experienced in life? What do you do to find peace, either alone or in community? Just what's an example that works for you?
This is not to be cliche, but being in queer spaces where I can set aside all of the masks that I still wrestle with religiously and just be. Everybody needs those spaces, whether you're a queer person and that is a gay nightclub. I live above a gay nightclub, so it's very convenient here in New York.
So fun.
But everybody needs one of those spaces where you can go and just be with people that understand, are not going to question you. And I've rediscovered worship in this space, and what it means to be laid bare before God and before other people and be proud of who you are. And so that's where I find some of the most freedom and healing.
It's so good. Lately for me, and this is one of the reasons where it's like, for a while I wasn't sure what I if I believed it was something beyond me. And my story, and that's one I've read about in Stumbling, is I just kept bumping into God, or God literally just grabbing hold of me. And so there have been times where I felt like a lack of peace. And it's so crazy how I will be like, well, I don't know about this. But as a kid, I would experience so much shame and fear from my family. And so there'd be these moments where I'd turn into the corner of my bed and I would just talk to God. And it's really funny because I've returned to that, where I'm like, I'll turn on my bed and I'm like, I have questions about who exactly you are, but I know that you're good. And there is a peace that you bring. And so I'm not willing to let that go. I'm not willing to let the evangelicals win that and take that from me. So it's been also, I guess, cliche, because it is for me, it feels like prayer. And so that's been new and really good, where it's just like being still in my room and coming with questions, coming with venting, or just simply being there. Has been so good. I totally agree with Robertson about those spaces. They're so good. It's probably I didn't see those protesters because I've been mainly in those spaces. But that's been so good for me. And I've been loving Quakerism lately. That's another thing that's been bringing me a lot of peace. So those are mine.
Thank you both. This has been wonderful. For me, peace is having little bits of community just like this, even if it's online on these screens with electrons and everything. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening and that you find your peace even tonight. And we will put this up as a recording, just so the speaker's showing. And if you want to tell friends about it, that would be great. But thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.